the columns in Freemasonry, the pillars, the two pillars, which is often depicted on either side of the square and compass. Everything that they do is extremely symbolic. All of their imagery and symbols have meaning. And now this is only a 101 crash course on Saturn symbolism, so I'll try and keep it as simple as I can, but just realize that this is the sun, or the light, shining through the two pillars. It's a representation of the Antichrist. It also has a numerical significance that explains this. If you lay it out with the seal of Saturn, the two X's between two pillars, you get the Roman numerals IXXI. This forms two different numbers. The IX makes 9, and the XI makes 11. Why is this important? What does this signify? 9, 11. Well, in order to understand what they represent together, we first need to understand what 10 symbolizes to the occult. 10 is comprised of a 1 and a 0. In the occult, 10 represents God. It represents a perfect number. It represents non-duality. Think about binary code, where you write code in nothing but ones and zeros. A 1 represents on, and a 0 represents off. Yes, no, true, false, and so on and so forth. So when you have the 1 and a 0 in the occult, it is Satan's way of copycatting, if you will, the Alpha and Omega, the first and the last. And Satan represents that number with a 1 and a 0. So in the occult, a 1 and a 0 represents God. Now, when you have 9 and 11 next to each other, what that is signifying is skipping God, because 9 is 1 less than 10 and represents the fallen, or the fallen angels, and 11 is 1 more than God. It represents being above God, skipping God and becoming godlike yourself. So, when we have 9 and 11 next to each other, it is surpassing God, the number 10. So going 9 straight to 11 and skipping 10. It represents the Antichrist. Now sometimes when you're researching the occult, you will notice on some of the artwork for Freemasons, you will see instead of the square and compass, a middle pillar. They refer to that pillar as the 13th pillar, and this is why. 9 plus 11 equals 20. This represents the Antichrist. Jesus is referred to by the occult as representing 13 because he had 12 disciples, which made him the 13th. Satan and these occult groups want to bring about the Antichrist, and the way to do that is through creating a forgery of what Jesus did. And when you take 13 and add it to 20, you get 33, as in the 33rd degree of Freemasonry, as in the illumined ones, 666. The funny thing is, Satan thought he was being coy by crucifying Jesus on a cross, which, as we have already discussed, represents an X, when in reality, remember, he was crucified between two others, creating this 13th pillar symbolism, this stargate or wormhole symbolism, rupturing the fabric of space and time. He escaped the cube when he died on the cross. Jesus dying on the cross was a lot more significant than people realize. But 9 and 11 also can represent gene manipulation, or in other words, creating life or prolonging life without God, and directly goes against God's wishes. Now, if you also were to take into account that the 9 and 11 derive from the seal of Saturn, which represents law and order, and 9/11 can also be attributed to gene manipulation or medicine, and Saturn is associated with Hades, which is a fiery hell, it makes sense that you would call 911 911 on your phone if you were faced with one of these three dilemmas. You can either get the police, which elicits law and order, you can call to report a fire, or you can call an ambulance and get medicated. So in other words, in case of an emergency, we are numerically instructed and reinforced time and time again to call upon the Antichrist to save us. Just food for thought there. Now, if we jump back again to the original hexagon shape that we get from Saturn, we can also form two S's from the hexagon, and these two S's can again represent many things. They can represent lightning, or they can represent the serpent, and the serpent represents time. You can also see another symbol that represents time present in the hexagon by way of the shape of an hourglass. So we can clearly see how Saturn has its associations with time, but the serpent also represents ascension to the occult. So what am I getting at now? Well, some occult groups believe that there is actually more to Saturn than just another planet in our solar system. Some believe that fallen angels actually reside there. Some believe it is a literal Hades. Now, I have no idea if that's true or not. I'm just telling you what they believe. And they also believe that there are pressure points all over the globe, and the energy from these pressure points all over the globe can be harnessed in a way that creates a wormhole or a gateway or a stargate or whatever you want to call it, that creates a kind of immediate connection between Earth and Saturn, between this world and the next, between our dimension and their dimension. And the way that this is accomplished, in theory, is by smashing together light particles and ripping into the fabric of space and time. And this is the heart of what all of these symbols represent. That is the main secret that the occult harness, is the ability to create these wormholes. And the instructions for this are depicted in their symbology. And to top it all off, we have Saturn, which on a two-dimensional plane can be viewed as a circle within a circle, representing the illumined ones, which makes the number 666. So as you can see, Saturn has all this different symbolism associated with it, and that is why the occult love Saturn so much. It's because you can derive all of these different meanings from it. Saturn is a symbol, and the occult are trying to bring about the Antichrist by manipulating Jesus dying on the cross. Now, the problem is, a lot of people researching the occult will look at these three crosses, see the symbolism there, and associate the three X's to symbolizing 666. And that is true, but that is an occult interpretation. And this is a very distinct difference. And if you get nothing else from my video, you need to understand this, and that is that God does not use man-made symbols, okay? The reason I say this is because the occult, or at least several of the occult groups, derive 666 simply from these 3 crosses, when in reality, the symbols that God made are far more important than the man-made symbols. So it's not the cross where they should be getting their numerology from, but the person on the cross. 6 is the number of a man. There was a man to the left and to the right of Jesus on the cross. They both represent a 6. But Jesus was God. So he does not make the 666. He breaks through that. And when you have the seal of Saturn, which symbolizes 9 and 11, and it is missing the 13th pillar, Jesus did not represent an X. He represented a 10 because he was God. He connected the 9 and the 11. He merged the 2 worlds. He created a gateway. He escaped the prison. He escaped the cube. He went beyond this dimension. And that is why it is so significant that Jesus rose from the dead and ascended into heaven, because he was not confined by the terms of this dimension.